Um, okay.
I'll tell you
Can you
when.
see the right display, Sally?
No, you got to switch it.
There we go. Good morning, Friday friends. It's been a big week. I feel like I say that every week, and every week it's true. So we'll get started. Lots going on at both the state and the federal level. Um, Wisconsin State Senate session ended on Tuesday. So for the last couple of weeks, we've been talking about what are the bills that have already passed the Assembly that if the Senate passed would be able to go to the governor's desk. And there are a couple of disability related bills that are now going to be decided whether they become law or not. Some lots of attention has been paid to a bill that would let hospitals pick decision makers according to a set group of hierarchy in the state statutes. And disability, aging, and legal advocates have been very consistent about all of our concerns about the bill. There's some links to the memos that the legislature has received on the bill from some of the coalition members. And we really think that the bill puts patients at risk of exploitation and abuse because the person that the hospital picks essentially gets the same powers. It does give the same powers as the guardian of an estate, so it can technically liquidate property and accounts and all of the authority that goes with the guardian of the state, and it gets the same um, authority as guardian of the person, so it can make decisions for the person, including where they live and other things, all without any court oversight or really accountability after the fact. So there was a press statement that Survival Coalition and the Wisconsin Aging Advocacy Network released after the bill passed on Tuesday. This might be something you want to share on your social media or with your networks. The bill has already been sent to the governor's desk. And that means the clock has started ticking under the Wisconsin state constitution once a bill has been sent to the governor. And that can happen in a couple of ways. There's the legislature can kind of push a bill to the governor's desk to start that 6 day clock under the Constitution where the governor either has to decide to veto or approve or sign a bill into law. The governor can request a bill early, or if neither of those things happen, there are certain dates, and April 2nd is the next date where all bills get sent to the governor's office if they haven't already gotten there already. So this bill that passed on Tuesday has already been sent to the governor's office. And that decision of whether to sign or veto has, you know, it needs to happen within a certain time period. The governor can always decide to sign or veto something sooner than the 6 days. So if you have thoughts about this bill, it is really important. The next decision maker is the governor's office, and it's important for you to connect with that office and tell them your thoughts about this bill and what you think the decision the governor should make is as soon as possible. Um, we saw many of you at Survival's Disability Advocacy Day yesterday, and we got quite a few questions about, well, how did my representative or state senator vote on this bill? Um, and maybe in a future webinar, we'll kind of go through like how do you know what your legislators are signing on to um, and other things, and how do you figure out what they voted on? Because that information is all publicly available, and it can be really helpful for constituents to kind of see what are the interests of their members and how do their members feel or vote about certain issues. So every bill has a web page, and there's a link to it here, and that will let you see all the action that has happened on that bill. You can see who are the people who put their names on the bill as co-sponsors, which means they agree with the idea, essentially. You can get a link to the actual bill text. You can see amendments that were introduced and see, votes on whether or not they passed. You can also see the record of committee proceedings where they actually put together the testimony that people left behind at a public hearing. And then if a bill is, makes it through, so it is scheduled for a floor vote by the full assembly or the full Senate, there is often a record of how each member voted on that specific bill. And you can access that on the bill's webpage as well. I've pulled out that information for you here because a bill that's made it through a lot of process often has lots of process and links. So just this is the assembly. We'll go through the Senate next. Remember, there's 99 assembly districts. And what you see here on the graph is that it passed. There's a summary statement of how many ayes, that's a yes vote, how many nays, no, and how many people didn't vote on the bill. So they didn't vote yes or no. And so if you know the name of your legislator, um, you can go down the alphabetical list, and I'm just going to take Anderson because it's the top of the list. And you can see in the first column, there's an N, which means that representative voted no. They voted against passing the bill. And then there's the name of the legislator. And then the right-hand column is the party affiliation. So an R meaning Republican or a D meaning Democrat. So you can look up who your representative is and see how they voted on the bill. And there are 33 state assembly or state senators, and you can also see how they voted on the bill. So in addition to contacting the governor's office, who is really the decider now on whether this becomes law or not, you can also contact both your state assembly person and your state senator and let them know how you feel about this bill and give them some feedback about their vote. If you sometimes if a bill passes that you really like, it's nice to follow up with a legislator and say, hey, I saw you voted in support of this. Thank you for that. And here's why I support it too. Sometimes when legislators vote yes on a bill that you oppose, it is equally valuable to say, hey, I see you voted to support this bill that I really don't think is a good idea, and here is why. And both of the reasons are even when there's been a decision made on a bill, the member has already voted. It's really important for legislators to know that their constituents are watching and they're taking an interest in what the legislature is doing, and they're also watching how they vote. That's part of being the accountability that constituents can have on their legislators is sometimes supporting them when they do things that you think are good, and also telling them when they have acted in a way that you think is not great for constituents. Another bill that passed on Tuesday that we have talked about before is AB 180, which provides the additional funding needed to make sure that Wisconsin's food share program can comply with the new requirements that under federal HR 1. There's a second component of this bill that also directs our Department of Health and Human Services to ask permission from the U.S. Department of Agriculture to have waiver so that folks in Wisconsin who use food share aren't allowed to buy certain kinds of products with them. And the bill says candy and soda are the kinds of products that people will not be able to use with their food share. So again, the governor's office will be in the position of deciding whether or not this bill can become law. Um, and it is okay. Sometimes you have a bill that is a so-called mixed bag, where you can say, we really support this part of it, but this part isn't so good. That is also a fine message to send. In this case, Wisconsin, whenever this bill is signed into law, we've had many months where the legislature did not act to pass this funding, which has put Wisconsin in a position where it does not have the workers in place yet to do all of the extra work and other requirements that started being phased in October and December. And even when it's signed into law, it will take some time to hire those workers. So this is important funding that is being potentially granted in this moment in time, but it's important for us to remember that the actual requirements and the workload and the potential for making mistakes have actually already started. So we are kind of behind in terms of having what we need in place to be able to make sure that the state is not penalized financially and has to pay a lot more to keep food share running in the next budget cycle. Just an article for your reading pleasure. There are a number of states that have put in place either similar statutes or have asked the USDA for similar waivers to not allow people who are using their state's version of food share to purchase certain products. So the good news for Wisconsin is there are lots of states who have gone before, and that is sometimes helpful because you can see what did or didn't work well in those states and maybe be able to design your waiver application to kind of minimize problems. Also, because there are states that have gone before, one of the features of the bill that passed was actually funding to help put a system in place that would help retailers figure out which products are on the okay to buy or can't be sold list to people with food share. This is an example of a state that has a law in place, but it also does not the words that are in the statute are open to interpretation, and so it kind of shows that sometimes these policies, the ideas that the legislature has about what it means and what it actually translates into when people are trying to figure out at the cash register whether or not they can use the money on their card to purchase a product is more complicated, especially if the language isn't clear. So hopefully, Wisconsin will have a process to get to apply for a waiver, and there may be a public comment opportunity. And so people like yourselves can kind of now add that onto a list of things to watch and make sure you're raising the issues that maybe haven't been thought about to make it as easy for people on food share to and retailers to be able to meet the new policy. Another bill that passed Tuesday would let people who are in the Medicaid buy-in, sometimes called the Work Incentive Program for people with disabilities. It's called the Medical Assistance Purchase Plan, or MAP for short, allow them to put more of their earnings into a MAP independence account, which is kind of like a savings account, and to inherit up to a certain amount, $40,000 at one time without impacting their Medicaid eligibility. This is a bill that was actually pursued by a self-advocate, a former board member of ours, who is in the MAP program, and he's worked with this legislator before on some other pretty important reforms to the MAP program that have happened in the last 10 years. So it's a good example of this is a constituent-driven bill that has now made it all the way through the process, and it is making some changes to the program that will probably help many people who are trying to work and earn and save a little bit more. Another bill we haven't talked about in a while because it's already passed both the Senate and the Assembly, but the governor has not requested the bill be sent to him. The legislature has not pushed it to the governor's desk, is AB 614. And this is a bill that essentially gives teachers the ability to kind of choose which students they feel are causing enough of a disturbance that they should be excluded from the classroom. So this is another bill that we may have forgotten about because it passed actually in February, but there's been no decision on whether to veto or sign it into law because it hasn't gone to the governor's desk yet. And this is an example of a bill that if it doesn't get pushed or the governor doesn't request it, it would be in the pile of bills that would be sent to him as of April 2nd to start that time limited window by which the governor has to make a decision. One notable thing that did not happen, and again, this is really a decision of the Joint Finance Committee, so it is independent from the state meeting, the state session that the Senate session that happened on Tuesday is the additional money needed to end the Division of Vocational Rehabilitation wait lists that have been put in place since December and continue to grow. There's now more than 5,000 people on the wait list, with at least another additional 1,000 that keep getting added every month. And this is another example of when the legislature doesn't act, you know, in a certain time frame, it tends to perhaps create issues or greater issues down the road. So the department has said, like, if we got the money in place April 1st, which is like next week, I think, it would still take us through the end of this calendar year to work through all the people who are now already waiting and have been waiting since December. So that means the longer that the Joint Finance Committee delays in approving the funding, or if they don't approve the funding, that will just mean the wait list will continue to grow, and also the time it will take whenever there is funding available to move people from the wait list into jobs will be greatly increased. So this committee can still act even though the state Senate has concluded its business and adjourned. Most people think that if they don't do that fairly soon, the likelihood that they will act at all is greatly reduced. So this is an issue that, advocates will probably be doing some work on in the next couple weeks to kind of raise, awareness of what the consequences are when people have to wait, including consequences for school transition programs that can't get their students into DVR in a timely way, and also long-term care, where people have to apply for DVR to be told no and be told to wait, and then maybe can access some supports through Medicaid. That and Medicaid reimburses far less than DVR does. Yesterday, many of you were at Disability Advocacy Day. Survival Coalition put out a press statement about the day that kind of summarizes the main issues and talking points that folks covered, and we primarily focused on the need for more care infrastructure to support people in the community, and talked about the results of a summer survey Survival did, which really showed that most people with disabilities and older adults are relying a lot on unpaid family members to provide a good portion of their care, even if they are in long-term care programs like Family Care, Iris, and CLTS. And we also talked about, the continuing shortage of workers, which means more and more gaps are having to be filled by unpaid caregivers, or they're not being filled when people don't have caregivers and people are going without care. So a couple of action steps that you can take if you attended the day or didn't. You can certainly share this press release with your networks in your communities. You can, if you attended a meeting, it's always great to send a follow-up note, like a thank you for meeting with me note, and you can restate the points, or maybe you have some additional information that you wanted to give that you didn't have time to give in your meeting. It's a nice touch point to remind them of who you are and that you met and the issue that you are concerned about. And you can also ask your legislators for another meeting. And those meetings can happen close to your home, in your district. Lots of times, especially now that the legislature has ended its session, members are going to be spending a lot more time in their district, partly because they're campaigning for people to and trying to convince people to vote for them, but also because they're not in Madison doing work on bills anymore. So it's often a very good time to kind of sit down and meet with your legislators and continue to talk about disability issues and educate them. Next week, probably, we will start talking about some of the members who are now announcing that they are not running for reelection. Some of them may be people who represent your area, and also what elections are coming up, that so you can know kind of who the candidates are and do some connecting with potential candidates who want to run for office. Folks who are elected to next year's state legislature are going to be making a lot of very big, important decisions, as will the next governor, on budget items. And as we have seen in many other states already, lots of states are proposing big cuts to disability services, specifically home and community-based services and Medicaid. So I think that it is reasonable to assume that given the state's fiscal picture and some of the pressures that we see, that the folks that are going to end up being in the legislature and in the governor's office and in state agencies will be having a lot of decisions that they're making that will directly impact people with disabilities and their families, even more so than normal. There is still discussion, even though we've closed the regular session. The governor has the ability to call for a special session. And the Senate, the Senate and the Assembly kind of have to agree to do that. Oftentimes, when the governor calls for a special session, it's to ask the legislature to consider either specific legislative proposals or a specific topic. There continue to be signs and rumors that the governor is negotiating a potential tax revenue reduction bill with Republican members, and that in exchange for some reductions in the amount of money that the state is getting in, that bill could include some unknown short-term spending increases. To It is not clear that the Senate Democrats or Assembly Democrats are part of those negotiations at all. But as we've talked about, in a climate where we may be going into the next budget cycle, in high likelihood that there might need to be some significant cuts, and having seen other states that have made reductions in revenue repeatedly in the past, now starting to make cuts instead of raising revenue to make up for shortfalls. It seems like this would be, any kind of revenue reduction now would probably impact the depth and the amount of cuts that might be necessary next year as, the costs of services continue to go up and we have less money coming in, both from state taxpayers and also from the federal government. Congress has started debating the Save America Act, which is a bill that has a lot of restrictions and new requirements that people would have to meet in order to be able to vote. We've covered it in the last few weeks, and there's a lot of pretty good information online about the details of what's in that bill. At this point, the Senate is debating the bill. And the president has been clear that this should be their number one priority to pass, and that he won't sign any other legislation unless this passes. And the president has also said he wants several amendments to be made to the bill, one of which is to ban mail-in voting. This week, there are a number of Republican senators whose states do mail-in voting who don't see that that is a good idea to ban mail-in voting. And this week, there has been some kind of signs of, negotiation where there's now a pitch for, well, maybe we can float a hardship exemption so we can ban mail-in voting except if you meet certain criteria, right? So we'll put in a ban and then have a paperwork requirement that people have to meet if they want to be able to mail in vote. Um, so that kind of is being seen as a sign of, well, maybe there's some movement by the president and some movement by the Republicans to get to something that is not an outright ban, but is more towards that than what we have now as a way to potentially add that language to the bill. There are also some House members that have said, well, we're not going to pass any more legislation unless the Save America Act passes. A lot of attention has been on the Senate because with the current filibuster rule, that would mean that 60 senators would have to vote yes in order to bring any bill to the full Senate floor. And every bill has to have a vote by the full Senate floor if in order to pass. So the filibuster is essentially a way that many bills can be prevented from having the floor vote necessary to move through the legislative process if there is not enough agreement by 2/3 of the senator that it's a good enough idea to be considered by the full body. Um, the Senate leader, Senator Thune, has been consistently opposed to the idea of getting rid of that 60 vote threshold. There are a number of Republican members who are saying maybe we should just get rid of the filibuster once and for all, because then it would only take 51 votes. And remember, the vice president is the person that breaks any ties in the Senate. And if we had a simple majority where we only needed 50 votes plus one, we know we could take this bill to the floor because we have, more than 50 Republican senators. There's a greater confidence that there would be enough Republican senators to move this bill only with Republicans if the vote threshold was less. So at this point, most watchers are saying we don't think this bill has a chance to pass if the filibuster rule holds. But Senator Thune has committed to 2 weeks of debate on the bill. And that means that essentially no other business gets done before the Senate. Today, he's saying we're not going to let Congress go home for the weekend and we're going to cancel the Senate recess because we're going to focus on this. So it's really unclear if you go with conventional wisdom and you take Senator Thune at his word that the filibuster is not going to be gotten rid of, it's really unclear whether this 2 weeks of debate is going to shift enough support to meet that 60 threshold. And the bill would not have a path to pass. If you think about will the pressure to remove the filibuster be successful, then this 2 weeks of debate could be looked at as a way to kind of grind people down until they are willing to move the bill forward. And they would need less votes to do so. Additionally, this week, The ongoing war in Iran is meaning that many of our military supplies are being depleted, and there are lots of expenses that are being incurred by that operation. So earlier this week, it was clear that the military probably would need an additional amount of money in addition to the $1 trillion budget that it had approved as part of the 2026 budget to cover the ongoing costs or the costs that have already happened for the current war in Iran. Yesterday, that supplemental funding bill, it was said that they were thinking it would be about a $200 billion request. And that figure could change. The formal request has not gone to Congress yet, but what's being telegraphed is about $200 billion, maybe a little more, maybe a little less. One of the insider publications in DC is seeing this as one of the last pieces of must-pass legislation that Congress might do this year. So this idea of a supplemental funding bill that is primarily military focused is kind of being seen by some members of Congress as the last train leaving the station, the last vehicle to get changes that you want made, either additional spending or spending cuts or policy changes included into a larger bill that maybe does what the military is asking for and then a lot of other things. That is, again, the approach that we saw last year with HR1, the reconciliation bill, where it was a very large bill that actually did many, many things, all kind of lumped together. And the strategy for doing, those are called omnibus bills. The strategy for lumping lots of unrelated things together is that it becomes harder for a member to oppose the bill because there's enough things in it that they like or they want to outweigh maybe something that they object to. There are some people who are wondering if this supplemental funding bill might be they might use a reconciliation process to move the bill forward. And again, a reconciliation bill has kind of special requirements. It has to be budget focused and it has to have language that will meet the Senate rules for being included. And the advantage for using that particular process is that, again, it bypasses the 60 vote threshold to bring a bill to the floor in the Senate and allows the bill to be brought to the Senate with only 50 votes plus one if there's a tie, which again, the vice president is the tie maker. So there are some people who are kind of wondering if this new spending need is going to be kind of used as a way to do another reconciliation bill and then maybe include other things that are not that 200 billion military spending request. Historically, when there have been spending increases, there is a group of primarily fiscal, we call them fiscal hawks, primarily in the Republican Party, and there are many of them in the House who have said, well, if you're going to spend more over here, that means you have to cut more over somewhere else. And again, that was a strategy that was used last year in HR1, and the reducers in tax revenues coming into the federal coffers were offset by $1 trillion in spending cuts to Medicaid and about 300 and something odd billion dollars in cuts to SNAP. So, kind of it's a similar strategy that could be employed here. Nobody knows anything, but this is something that we're going to have to watch in Congress, especially if this might be where all of their focus and their time is going to go, and if they really believe that this is the last thing they're going to do this year. This week also, the same day as the end of the state Senate session, Tuesday, the House held another hearing on Medicaid and Medicare fraud and um, focused on, the strategies that CMS is currently doing in states like Minnesota and potentially soon other places as well on what they are trying to do in the name of going after Medicaid and Medicare fraud. So you can watch the entire hearing if you want at this link. I've also included a post where they kind of summarize the main ideas that at least majority members of the committee have. Um, there's a new kind of angle that was brought up at the hearing that somehow there's not only a lot of fraud, but the fraud is being committed by multinational crime organizations. So not people who are necessarily in the country. External foreign actors are the ones committing fraud. That's a new idea is being added to the mix. For their part, the minority members on the committee um, really pointed out that cutting the way that the CMS is approaching cutting funding is going to directly impact disabled and elderly people, especially if home and community-based services are targeted, which it really does appear that CMS is focused on that particular set of services that are optional under federal Medicaid law. Still in the mix, the Department of Homeland Security is not funded. That is the one agency that did not have their 2026 federal budget process, federal budget approved. They've been shut down for, I believe, 4 weeks, largely over concerns about how Border Patrol and ICE is operating, but the Homeland Security does other things as well, including, disaster response and the Transportation Security Administration. It does not look like there's going to be any urgency or a quick resolution to funding that agency. We're still going to be waiting on the president's budget. And in the midst of all this, the Senate is supposed to be starting its 2027 federal appropriations process. So yes, we just passed the 2026 budget, and now we're starting on the one for next year. So this week, this is a really important article that was written this week, and it is written in response to some of the um, allegations the administration is making that if there are spending areas in Medicaid that are high or increasing, that's a reason to suspect fraud. Remember, we have talked about in the last couple of weeks that there's been a selective data release that kind of excluded some of the largest spending categories, which has meant that home and community-based services is the data that is the highest spending. Plus, there was a report by an outside think tank that kind of said, hey, home and community-based spending, that's where, there is a lot of opportunity for fraud because the management of it is decentralized. You're not concentrating people into one place. You are going into people's homes, as well as not only action against states like Minnesota, but the CMS director actively engaging and making videos about multiple states alleging fraud, specifically in home and community-based services, including home health care and other things. So this article is really useful. This is maybe something you'd want to share with your network or your state legislators. You could even highlight bits of the article with them because it's very clear that no, spending more in home and community-based services and those services being used more is not evidence of fraud that's happening. And really, it should be expected that we're spending more on these services because for many decades, the federal policy and state policies have been shifting to away from spending in institutional services into spending in home and community-based services. Um, and there's more older people who are potentially, needing these services. And also, one of the reasons for shifting towards home and community-based services is to meet civil rights laws like the Americans with Disabilities Act and several court rulings like the Olmstead decision in 1999, which are supposed to guarantee people have access to services in the community instead of states saying, well, we don't do that, so your choice is only institutions. It's also a really good article in terms of it sets out that there's already a lot of protections in place to detect and minimize fraud. And it goes through kind of in pretty big detail. So if you're going to read one article this week, I'd recommend it be this one. Um, and it kind of goes through what many of you have lived through in the last 30 years, perhaps, like this shift of we were spending most of our money in institutions at one point, and now we're shifting and spending more money to keep people in the community instead of institutions. And we've actually changed federal law to achieve that policy goal, to move towards that policy goal, and states have followed with by using that authority that the feds allow to set up waivers like family care and IRIS and CLTS that are specifically designed to serve people who would otherwise be in an institution. Um, it, home and community-based services are an institutional substitute. And now they prevent people from going into institutions. It is a institution diversion policy approach, which I think is important. It's also the way that lots of states are meeting their obligations under federal civil rights law to make sure that there are options for people to have services in the most integrated settings possible, which has been in your own home, in the community. Um, and home and community-based services at this point are really limited to people who meet a certain care threshold and would otherwise be in institutional settings. They're also supposed to be cost neutral. In other words, the services that are offered in the community can't cost more than what it would do to keep the same person in an institution. So I think it's a really good way of framing that these services are actually multi-purpose and um, they have strong fiscal guidelines. They are for a specific group of people, and that they are a policy approach that is meeting kind of the larger civil rights and integration requirements that other federal laws have. For those of you who want to know a little bit more about, well, how much more cost effective is it to have somebody in their home versus an institution, there is a lot of research that shows this is a cheaper option for states, and it is one of the driving reasons why many states have moved towards home and community-based services. They're doing an optional set of services under federal Medicaid law because it financially makes a lot of sense to do so. You would rather pay for those services than pay a lot more to only do the mandated institutional services. And all states have kind of moved more towards home and community-based services than institutions in the last few decades. This article is also really, really clear that if you cut home and community-based services, for whatever reason, the likely fiscal impact is that you will pay more, that you will save $1 over here to spend $3 more in another part of your budget. And that, the idea of cutting these optional services because you can actually does not save money and might cost far more than any savings um, from your effort, from any claims to reduce fraud. We have talked about a lot of the protections that Wisconsin and systems that Wisconsin has in place. This article also has a pretty good overview of what are the ways that the states and the federal government are already using to identify fraud, which with that aren't disrupting, the normal payments to providers and services to individuals. EVV is one of those items, but there's also a lot of other requirements that many providers are aware of. Enrollment screening, background checks, audit potential for audits, all sorts of things that are in place that are trying to oversee and guarantee that the money being reimbursed is going for services that are allowed to people who are allowed to have those services, and that nobody is making claims that shouldn't be made. And this article is also really clear that some of the strategies that CMS has done in states like Minnesota are really a ineffective way to address fraud. So the idea of just withholding payments, not paying out reimbursement claims that have already been made, or not giving states, their Medicaid match, means that you're taking money away from the operational money away from the providers that are providing the services. And as soon as you have folks become uncertain about whether the care they provide will actually be paid for and in a timely way, that makes it an unstable business prospect to continue serving populations who rely on Medicaid for daily care, primarily people with disabilities and older adults. Um, some of these things are not necessarily new news to the folks who attend these webinars, especially if you're aware of lots of providers who, especially have Medicaid payments that are really dependent on the Medicaid money coming in and on time in order to cover the costs of care they've already provided. So this article is really clear about like these larger, broader strategies that are being done in the name of fraud are actually directly impacting and harming the people who are in the Medicaid program, and may in fact further erode the provider capacity and network that exists, as providers decide they either can't serve as many Medicaid patients or need to take people who need a lower level of care, or they go out of business altogether or decide that they're not taking any Medicaid patients. Kaiser Health News kind of did a good overview of, well, what are these new strategies that CMS is doing? What is the difference between a deferral and a withholding, for example? So for those of you who want to dig down and really know like what the difference is, this is a pretty good article, and it has a nice little graph here. And the way I like to think about deferrals is we're not paying claims that have already been made. And I like to think about withholding of, we're not going to pay you for future costs that you haven't incurred yet. Because remember, Medicaid is a matching program. So the states put in 40% and then the federal government provides 60. A withholding is the federal government saying, we're not going to provide our share for future costs. Usually states get kind of a lump sum, on a routine basis, because there's lots of claims that are happening all the time. So Minnesota is the first state that has had both of those strategies happen to them from CMS. And both of these strategies are really unusual. CMS has not typically used them before, because they have such a huge impact on the people who rely on Medicaid for care. Um, and as a reminder, already Minnesota has been told by CMS we won't pay $260 million in reimbursement claims that have already been submitted unless you prove that those funds should be paid for. In other words, we're going to set up a paperwork criteria for you to have to prove that all of the claims that have been submitted are in fact legitimate, and should be paid before we will pay anything. And again, those 14 categories that are referenced are really home and community-based service categories. Um, it's not chiropractic services. It's things like home health care and personal care, those types of things. Um, CMS has used this technique before, but very infrequently and often very narrowly, right? So there might be a specific set of claims that maybe they want the state to kind of look at more closely. That is very different than we have 14 different service categories, and we're going to tell you that we suspect every claim that has been billed for in that whole category. Um, it is unclear how the state of Minnesota is going to gather and the proper evidence to prove that these claims should be paid and how quickly that that will happen. Because there's a lot of workload on the state's part, to try and get in whatever they think will prove the claim. It might mean that providers are being asked for more things too. And then, of course, nothing happens until CMS says it's okay. So you can kind of see there's a big delay already here between we're not going to pay for what claims you've already incurred and gathering, the gathering whatever is necessary that will, that will convince CMS to pay those claims. There's a lot of distance in time there when, of course, for providers who are really relying on that money, they may not be able um, to weather that kind of time delay. CMS is also telling Minnesota, we're also going to withhold. In other words, not going to send you money for future care, um, because we don't think your plan that we asked for is good enough. Um, so in addition to the deferrals, we already have 260 million of claims that will be unpaid with a promise that they will keep doing that over the course of this year. This action is separate and would potentially withhold almost 2 billion annually in future federal funding from the state. So you can kind of see that both of these steps taken at the same time, we're talking about $1 billion potentially in current and future deferrals, as well as maybe $2 billion in withholdings. That is a $3 billion budget hole that Minnesota did not expect to have um, at this moment in time. Minnesota isn't the only state. There were 4 states that got a letter from CMS asking, and many people feel like those 4 states are probably the first states that are going to have deferrals and withholdings perhaps applied to them. Minnesota was one of those states. They're the first state where that's happened. And the previous article was saying, we don't think this is the last state. California, New York, and Maine were the other 3 states that were mentioned in CMS's letter. And of course, the House committee has added in other states, all focused on how are you spending money on home and community-based services. So it's significant that the CMS director is now focusing attention and alleging fraud in California, because California is one of the states where that got the same letter, essentially a similar letter to Minnesota. And again, you can see there's a new line of rhetoric, kind of asserting that there may be foreign criminal actors who are taking advantage of California's Medicaid, and getting paid by California Medicaid without them knowing it. Um, and the CMS is also, telegraphing we're going to halt a lot of money in payments to California, again, citing we want certain information from the state, and if we don't get it, this will be the consequences. Um, Also, even though this article is about California, the same things are now happening in Maine and New York, where there are definitely, efforts by the CMS director to kind of paint those states in with the same paintbrush that, somehow there is lots of alleged Medicaid, fraud there, and Florida has also been, added to this list. Just for note, you know, when people looked at the most recent data, yes, there is some fraud across the country and across different services, not only home and community-based services. And most of the fraud is from health insurers and other people who are in the country. And that California actually has a pretty robust fraud system that is catching and recovering a lot of those fraud dollars. So again, like what is being said and maybe narratively used to justify future action is not borne out by what the data shows. But if you're Minnesota or California and the federal agency just will not pay claims that are already there and is going to withhold future payments, the result is that you have a huge state budget problem that you cannot possibly cover easily, which kind of puts the state in the position of deciding whether they can raise revenue or make cuts or some combination thereof to fill that hole where they thought federal money would be, and now it isn't in a very unpredictable way. Um, oh, I screwed up my slide. Anyway, more about Minnesota. The the reality here is that, the impact on Minnesota's budget with these two things happening is pretty immediate. And it is going to cause the state a lot of real stress to figure out, in a time of uncertainty, because you don't know when CMS is really in control of deciding when the state has done enough and whether or not they are going to pay old bills or provide money for future care. This has injected a lot of immediate fiscal impact in the short term, as well as long-term uncertainty about whether the programs that people rely on will, receive the federal dollars that they're supposed to pay for them. Also in the news this week, we have talked about various actions on vaccines over the course of the last few months. Many people who are immunocompromised or are too young, or maybe have vaccines, but that vaccine's effectiveness has worn off as they age, really rely on the rest of the population to be vaccinated in order to lessen their exposure to disease. And there are certainly people, with autoimmune disorders or underlying health conditions that maybe can't be vaccinated because of those conditions. So it is an issue that we've been following, because there have been many changes in the last few months, and changes to what vaccines are recommended, and at the federal level. So the important thing here is that, a couple of medical organizations actually sued, the decisions that the Department of Health and Human Services has put in place, namely the removal of certain vaccines or from the vaccination schedule for children. And what the case is really about is, does the secretary have power to do that? And whether a judge can determine, who qualifies that, like qualifies as an expert to make those decisions. So, like many of the other cases that we've covered, we kind of keep adding cases to the pile. This is a temporary decision. And what it means in this moment of time is that a couple of the things that the Department of Health and Human Services has already done are in limbo in terms of determining whether or not they will stay in place. So the judge isn't saying you can't do that, but we're also not there. He's also not saying you can. We're going to let this play out in court before a final decision is made. The ruling does say, hey, the way that this has happened is really out of step and out of keeping with the existing practice that has been in place for many years. And specifically, there are some requirements of, how rooted in scientific knowledge and other procedures these decisions have been pretty carefully made over the years, and that is not what's happened in the last few months. So that's really the crux of the question, is whether or not the actions that have already been taken are things that could be done by this particular secretary, and how do you determine if a decision has been made with the appropriate process and expertise, evaluating it after the fact. Um, However, there are a number of medical practitioners, even though they have been suing DHHS, and the previous ruling we talked about is positive, um, they're saying like the damage has potentially already been done because the removal of these particular vaccines from the childhood vaccination schedule has probably impacted access already. And it has also created a climate of doubt where lots of parents, have it's made it harder for parents to know who to trust and much more fearful and skeptical of vaccines. So, again, the idea of this action that has been taken, even if they win in court, the damage that has been done by the messaging and, this point in time where the recommendations for vaccines have changed and are now different from what many state health departments and major medical societies are recommending, has just added to the climate of confusion and mistrust, and it's resulting in fewer people becoming vaccinated. So much so that that there are now some new groups trying to kind of remind new generations of folks who haven't necessarily seen some of the diseases that we are now seeing a decline in vaccination rates for, to remind them what the impact was on people when there weren't vaccinations available. Measles is one disease that we're now starting to see outbreaks of, and lots of times the press will focus on people who die of measles, which does happen, right? But there's also um, diseases that can cause disability, and measles is one of them. And there are a couple articles where the particular story is about a person who got measles and got encephalitis and ended up having developing an intellectual and developmental disability because of the virus. It can also cause hearing loss and blindness in some people. And it's just one example of childhood disease that can have really long lasting impacts over the course of somebody's life. Polio is another one that many people might be familiar with. So there is a number of articles here, and there is there's a ProPublica article in here that does say, hey, there are models in other countries where when you've had a declining vaccination rate, we can see what has happened. not only in terms of disability rates from the diseases going up and deaths, but also, how long it can take for those diseases to be brought under control or reduced again. I think this particular item is also relevant to people with disabilities, not only because there is a disability connection with some of these diseases, but also it is an approach that for many of us might be useful when we talk about the times before home and community-based services were available. Again, the generations that lived in and knew what institutional life was like and lived in an era where the only public policy for people with disabilities was one of exclusion and one of segregating and setting aside and putting away in institutions is going away. There are people who can still remember in Wisconsin what it was like to wait for home and community-based services, what it was like to be in a county that didn't have family care when the next county did. And I think those are going to be very important things that we have to bring to the forefront because the decision makers who are going to be making choices about what to cut or what not to do not have the expertise in people's lives. And they do also not have the content knowledge of why were these services put in place? What did life look like before them? And they don't necessarily see home and community-based services as a way to protect people's civil rights, as a way to divert people away from more expensive care, and as a way to support families and support people with disabilities to participate in the workforce, for example. So these are all messages that Survival Coalition was trying to elevate in Disability Advocacy Day, but it's also really important as you're talking with candidates and asking questions and, meeting with eventually whomever is newly elected and will be in the position to make decisions about funding for these services. It's really important that they hear and understand what those cuts would actually mean, especially if they are going backwards to a time that we thought maybe was in the past. Um, Another example of how important messaging is, and again, we're starting to hear a lot about Medicaid fraud in different ways, and you can kind of see this as a repetitive strategy where the message is talking about fraud, but the policy objective might not be about fraud. It might be about should we do this amount of services and what's the way what is the policy pathway that we could justify doing less of something. This is another example of when, people in a position of power say things, it really does matter. In September, we were covering a lot of the statements that were being made about autism, and there was a particular press conference where the president and the DHH secretary referenced a specific drug called leucovorin that they said, hey, this is a treatment for autism. And what happened after that statement was lots of people wanted that drug. They wanted that purported cure for autism, even though there have been relatively small studies and there really isn't any evidence that suggests this drug is effective at addressing symptoms of autism, much less reversing them, or that long-term use is in fact safe or without consequence to the people who use it. There is evidence that this particular drug is a helpful treatment for a different condition called cerebral folate deficiency. And the messaging that the president and the secretary said was much broader than that treatment, right? That's actually a pretty rare condition. There's about 50 cases of that cerebral folate deficiency worldwide. And interestingly, in the last week, the Federal Drug Administration did not add leucovorin as an approved treatment for autism. They did say it is a treatment for this much rarer condition called cerebral folate deficiency. So what was said in September, the Federal Drug Administration is not, putting into is not confirming with how they are regulating that drug. Um, but the damage that has been done is still there because you now have lots of people who maybe think that this drug is going to do a certain thing or result in a certain outcome, which might not happen, and also that it's safe when that might not be true either. Another and unrelated, different topic, but similar strategy. Again, back to voter data, we talked about Congress and the president really pressuring Congress to amend and pass the Save America Act. Um, in the meantime, the U.S. Department of Justice has been kind of pushing states to give them their voter data. And there are a number of states, including Wisconsin, that are engaged in a lawsuit because they don't want to provide that voter data to the federal government, partly because it's a lot of very sensitive data for a lot of people, and also because it is unclear what the federal government is intending to do with that data, especially since it really isn't a federal role for elections. That is a state-run um, state-run activity under the Constitution. Um, so now the Department of Justice is again connecting through what it's saying. It's trying to say, look, we've asked for this data from states, and some of them aren't giving it to us. So therefore, if they don't give us this data, that means that we can't guarantee that the election results are going to be fair and secure. We've had elections in this country for a couple hundred years where the results have not been in any way overseen by DOJ, and the DOJ has not had sensitive voter data for millions of people, where the election results have been certified by local clerks, and states have set up their own systems and have done a lot of election integrity. We've had elections in this country for a long time where the results were trusted and the results could be proven and validated without the US DOJ being involved at all. The fact that the US DOJ is now saying if we don't have this info, then we should, in some ways, we should not trust the results, is being perceived as a way that they're kind of seeding the rhetorical ground that perhaps whatever happens in the midterms shouldn't be trusted or should be challenged, and we shouldn't be accepted. And a lot of folks that watch election stuff find this particular kind of statement pretty worrisome. That it is, first that the department was asking for this data at all, and now that they're saying that if they don't get it, that proves that the results shouldn't be accepted. So continuing, to look around the country at what are some of the early impacts of the federal Medicaid cuts that are coming, more and more states are starting to look at what do they do in advance of some of the impacts of HR 1. Connecticut is now the latest state, and we've talked about them before, that is really looking first towards eliminating a program that serves people with disabilities who are trying to avoid institutions as being eliminating that program. Um, so the Community First Choice program in Connecticut is specifically is open to anybody who meets the level of care and also um, it meets the low income and asset limits that are specific to that program. Connecticut also has waiver programs, kind of like Family Care and Iris, but they aren't called that in Connecticut. But those waiver programs have long waiting lists. So the two things are not the same. And people can be waiting for years um, to get into the waiver, which means that either families are figuring out a way to do it all, or people are ending up in institutions because they don't have access to the services they need into the community. So the governor of Connecticut is saying, hey, there's no big deal here. Like, I'm eliminating this Community First program. And again, the rhetoric here is, well, it might be hard for some people to hire their own workers. And so we're relieving them of that hard thing to do by eliminating the program that they're in, that they chose to be in, and where people knew that they would have to hire their own workers. And we're going to put them in a program where they get workers through a provider agency. A lot of folks who are in these programs say, wait a minute, that is not a good reason here. And also, we're fine with hiring our own workers. And eliminating this program has its own problems because the programs that you want us to move into have long wait lists. And even though you're saying anybody who's currently enrolled in the Community First program will get to keep their current services, the people who are looking to newly enroll in those waivers that have waiting lists could end up on those waiting lists. So you could keep your services, except that you might not get them, is not really appealing to the people who are currently in the program. And lots of advocates are saying this does not sound like an actual plan where the care that I'm receiving now is guaranteed and I just get it under a different name. This seems like you're eliminating this very specific program that serves a very specific group of people, and you're kind of creating some reasons to do that, but it may result in some amount of not paying for that program in the budget, but it doesn't actually mean that the costs of care that I need are going to get covered by another program. So this is again yet another example to watch, and it is a place where the state is looking to cut here first because these are optional services and because they're high cost. Utah is the next state that is joining the growing group of states thinking about not only how to make cuts, but cuts that are specifically going to impact disability services. And there are actually a number of proposals. I was only able to find an article that explained kind of the budgetary one. But the impact is, again, should feel familiar and clear. Again, provider rate cuts are one of the items being proposed. And, advocate groups are saying, hey, if you cut those rates and workers' wages, that is going to mean that a lot of people who are being successfully supported now are no longer going to be. And I think that the thing to draw attention to here, both in Idaho and in Utah, is that people are just being blunt. They are saying the thing. They are drawing a very clear line from point A to point B. And I think that is a really important skill for all of us to get comfortable with in the next coming months and maybe years. You know, and a lot of the things that are being said in Utah are exactly the same things that people yesterday were worried about and Survival Coalition kind of put together as a theme for legislators to hear. There's not enough workers. Unpaid workers are, really shouldering a lot of care needs and they're not going to be around forever. And then what happens? So you're not alone. And I think this is just, again, a really good example of very much highlighting what is on people's minds and saying it in the simplest words possible so that lawmakers understand not only cause and effect, but urgency and could perhaps be moved by it. Moving to Idaho, there's been some back and forth. Um, Last week, there was a little bit of hope for advocates because a Senate committee said we don't want to consider this bill. We're going to delay and not vote on a bill that would cut $22 million in provider pay cuts for disability services. However, what is happening is the idea to cut disability services hasn't disappeared. It's simply gone underground and gone behind the scenes. And although there are some other ideas that are being pitched out there, it really seems like the proposal to cut disability services and to somehow find a way to pass the bill that the state Senate committee was uncomfortable with last week is the strategy here. And again, additive cuts to decisions that the Idaho legislature has made in the past. So they already made rate cuts in 2025 in response to HR 1 because their tax code was tied to the federal tax code. And now this is a second round of cuts, again, on disability services. So the bill has already passed Idaho's House. And it is one of the items, in the governor's proposal on here's what I would cut. And it's important to note that the governor's list of where to cut Medicaid listed several items related to people with disabilities, but not necessarily Medicaid expansion populations. And I only say that to illustrate again, why are we looking at disability services first? Because those are the people that have the highest costs over the longest period of time. It is where the spending is the largest. So if you are looking to cut a lot of dollars, it is logical to look at where are you spending the most and cut there. There is a bill in Idaho to repeal the Medicaid expansion, which again was a policy outcome that many watchers last year in the healthcare space thought could be something that was an impact of HR 1. So there is a bill out there. It seems like there's not the political will to repeal expansion, but there certainly does seem like there's the political will and desire to try and find a way to get to yes to disability cuts. Um, there are not a number of states that do pay family caregivers for providing care. And these states have sometimes put these policies in place because there are not enough paid caregivers to hire. And we've talked about in some states where those pay rates for family caregivers are actually part of cut lists, right? Like Colorado has proposed cutting paid family caregivers their rates. And I think there's been one or two other states that have done that as well. So this article is actually about something different, but it's related because in the pandemic, there was a greater expansion of the federal government allowing family caregivers to be paid. And since the pandemic, there have been a number of states who said this was a good idea and kind of adjusted their waivers. So this was an option, but that didn't happen everywhere. And now the flexibilities that were kind of in place during the pandemic have ended. So for some paid family caregivers, their ability to get paid has now ended with those flexibilities. And I think this article is relevant here in the sense that there is now some um, you can evaluate the impact of what it means to stop paying some family caregivers because these family caregivers who were being paid under the pandemic rules, they're not getting paid anymore. And we have other states who have made the decision to start paying family caregivers who are also choosing, to think about cutting those rates or stopping those services. And we have now an example of what happens when you choose to change that policy. Again, Idaho, um, they 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 are one of the states that decided to not extend those flexibilities. And what happened is that, the same thing we live with in reality. There's no more workers to hire. So you can't pay the family caregivers anymore, and there's no paid workers to be able to hire. So for a lot of people, that has meant that they have to basically forego work or rearrange their lives to provide the care now unpaid that they used to be compensated for because there just isn't anybody else to step in. Um, so that's creating a lot of very familiar worries for a lot of families in Idaho and potentially in other states where there are policies for family caregivers to be paid. It shows you what the impact may be when you reduce the rates paid to family caregivers to be low enough that they can't afford to not go to work anymore and that the gaps that are created when family caregivers can't provide the same level of care are not going to be filled by a workforce that really isn't in place, that there aren't workers to fill in the gaps that family caregivers are now filling. In South Carolina, there are some hospitals that are thinking about the forthcoming impacts of cuts to HR1 and trying to say, hey, maybe we need to change some language in the statutes to give ourselves a new designation. So again, groups are thinking about these cuts are coming. Is there a way that we can change how we do things that can make the impact less? And I think this is an interesting article because like the idea of changing or allowing more hospitals to have a slightly different designation isn't actually without impact. Um, in this case, you're trading, they are anticipating that they will not have as many people in Medicaid or get as much Medicaid money. So they're looking for what is a different alternative, what is a different source of money. And the designation that they are advocating for is for something new, a rural emergency hospital, so they could get more money from Medicare. So more money from Medicare might offset some declining revenue from Medicaid and some more kind of annual stipend. But there's a cost to doing that designation. That would mean that the services that the hospital actually offers are drastically reduced. Um, and so, it isn't the hospital is looking for how do I get out of a financial problem? But the way of getting out of that financial problem also has its own costs, which essentially reduce services and access to care in the local community. California is also thinking about what are different ways to kind of raise revenue to offset some of the cuts that they know are coming. This is, California has a very large population and a very big Medicaid program. So LA County is there's a lot of people in LA County, and There's a lot of folks that are low income and actually homeless and other things that rely on Medicaid as their only access to healthcare. So lots of healthcare providers in LA County are like threats to Medicaid and declining revenues from Medicaid are actually a real threat to our continued ability to stay open and provide services. What if we raised the sales tax by a certain amount to help raise more revenue to kind of offset the money that we're losing from the federal government? And in this case, it is a local ballot proposal. So, just the city, it's not coming at the state. But other states are also looking at different ways of how do we increase tax revenues to offset Medicaid costs. A little bit of, a hope out there that it just doesn't all need to always be about cuts, even though that is what many states are doing first. It also can be about what do we do to raise funding to preserve some of the services that we have. Iowa is also doing a similar approach. They are thinking ahead and going, how do we increase revenue to cover what we expect to be a pretty significant um, budget hole in Iowa's Medicaid program? So they are looking at a one-time tax increase. Again, they have a very low provider tax rate, which was capped in AR1, but they're below the cap. So they're trying to figure out a way, can we raise the revenue, under that cap and get permission to do so from CMS in order to raise this amount of money for a limited amount of time to, shore up some short-term holes in our Medicaid program. With that, I'm going to stop. A little choppy today. There's been a lot of activity this week.
All right. We really didn't have too many questions, just somebody asking for some links.